one person is labeled the perpetrator and one person or side is the victim. Everyone wants to be the victim instead of the perpetrator.
Today, it's great to have Dr. Kurt Gray on the podcast. Dr. Gray is a psychology professor at the University of North Carolina and author of the new book called Outraged: Why We Fight About Morality and Politics and How to Find Common Ground. Wow, what a timely book and timely episode. In this discussion, we discuss why people seem so divided today and why everyone seems to be filled with outrage for the other side. We also discuss the psychology of righteous indignation and Dr. Gray's views on moral psychology and his argument that deep down we all have the same harm-based moral mind. We also discuss how we can bridge moral divides. I'm a longtime admirer of Kurt's seminal research on morality and his theory of moral typecasting, where we treat victims as angels and perpetrators as pure evil. I learned a lot from this discussion, and I'm sure you will too. So without further ado, I bring you Dr. Kurt Gray. Professor Kurt Gray, welcome to the Psychology Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I've been really looking forward to this chat for a long time, and it couldn't be more relevant.
It's a contentious time.
It is. Your book is called Outraged.
That's right. Why we fight about morality and politics and how to find common ground.
Yeah, I really want to know the answer to all those questions.
Yeah,
all the questions you ask in your book. Now you got a PhD in social psychology from Harvard, right? Was it relating to morality?
That's right. It was with Dan Wegner, and so he studied all sorts of weird and wonderful philosophical things like free will and thought suppression. He didn't study morality, but he studied how we perceive the minds of others, and it turns out that's really closely related to our moral judgments. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, he's famous for the "don't think of a white bear" phenomenon, where all you do is think of a white bear if you try not to. Yeah. Okay, so what was your dissertation on? My dissertation was on how the feeling of pain and a little bit pleasure, but mostly pain, changes on the intention of the person who's giving it to you. So if you think someone's hurting you maliciously, giving you an electric shock, I did a lot of shocking of Harvard undergraduates. If you think you're getting shocked intentionally and maliciously, it physically hurts more than if you think you're getting shocked accidentally or benevolently. Hard to imagine getting shocked benevolently, but we figured out how to make that happen.
So you direct the Deepest Beliefs Lab and the Center for the Science of Moral Understanding at the University of North Carolina. And you have a child, right?
2 kids, yeah.
2 kids. Now, how do you manage 2 laboratories? I've never heard of anyone having 2 laboratories at a university. I've never heard of this. And have a family. And I mean, how do you do it all?
Yeah, I ignore the cat. So that's how you got to cut corners somewhere. And I spend less attention with the cat. But one's the lab. It's about running studies. And then the center is a little broader. It's kind of more, international collaborations, funding, scholars, things like that. So they kind of connect with each other. But it's busy for sure. Yeah.
You say, quote, "My job is to make sense of moral disagreement and find ways to help people in conflict understand each other." Is that still roughly what you do?
Yes, you bet. Increasingly, my research focuses on how to understand moral divides and how to bridge those divides.
Yeah, it's just so important. I mean, what as a social psychologist watching this political election, are you in bewilderment? Or you kind of get it? Maybe you get it. You understand what's going on. You're like, I get this.
Yeah, I mean, all humans, the human condition is bewilderment, I feel. But as far as the chaos of elections, I think folks like me who study intergroup conflict and our perceptions, it kind of makes sense.
Okay. Not to me. So let's make sense of it.
Yeah, let's dig into it.
That's why we're doing this podcast, right?
Exactly.
Righteous indignation is just something so interesting. It's not something. So it's a powerful, deep-seated human something. I don't know what it is. Righteous indignation. What would you call it? Is it a need of humans?
I mean, yeah,
feels like
it's a great question, right? No one. keep on thinking like no one wakes up in the morning, left, right, whether you're a politician or a pundit on either side, no one wakes up in the morning thinking, I'm a monster, I'm evil, right? Everyone thinks they've got the best intentions and they're doing the right things, or, maybe the ends justify the means, maybe we're doing some bad things, but ultimately for good. And so I think each one of us feels righteous and that we're doing good. And so when someone argues against us or does something different or believes something different, then that's where the indignation and outrage come in, right? Because if I'm moral and you're different, well, then you must be immoral.
Yeah, that's so true. People really are, it feels like more divided right now than pre-2016. Do you have any data that that's true? It just feels that way.
Great question. There is data on this. So increasingly, not only have policy positions moved apart as much as really any kind of average person, is really focused on policy. It's usually kind of focused on our group identity, but policy positions have moved apart. It's also the case that your dislike of the other party has gone up and up every year. So even if you don't like your party, then you really dislike the other party, right? You're like, I just don't want them to get into the White House. So it's less about us and more about not them.
Is this Trump's fault?
Well, it's probably complicated, but I think, some politicians...
He didn't help?
More than others, right? Kind of capitalize on concerns and fears and catalyze as kind of like feelings of us versus them. So certainly, there's a marked increase in kind of like animosity at around 2016.
I'm trying to just take a step back here and think if that's what it is. It feels like, I'm a personality psychologist. So I come at it with individual differences are gravitated to different messages. And, it feels like there are a lot of people who find standard politics as usual boring. And I feel like Trump is like, he for the first time in the history of politics brought entertainment, like WWF style entertainment to politics. And a lot of people, it suddenly, like, I feel like it took us, I feel like in 2016, we left the political domain and went into some other universe. and the traditional politicians and way of talking and everything suddenly became like, oh, that's old news. That's boring.
Yeah, it's a good point, right? I think over the decades, it's been increasingly about entertainment, right? So the first televised debate where Kennedy looks so much better than Nixon, for instance. And then we get to now, right, where, Arnold Schwarzenegger was governor, right? Even Reagan, was president in the 80s. And so I think it's increasingly become about, who you trust, what kind of personality, talk about personality, what kind of personality do you trust to kind of protect you and your interests? And I think the rise of populism recently has been really about like, let's put our faith in strong personalities who, people don't necessarily think that Trump is, moral in the kind of classic ways we might think about it. But I think those who are voting for him thinks he'll stand up, right, for their rights and protect them. And I think that's ultimately what our votes and our moral judgments are about, right? Concerns about protecting ourselves and our family.
Yes. You say deep in our minds, every fight about morality comes down to one thing: competing perceptions of harm. We get outraged at people when they deny our assumptions about what causes suffering and when they reject our views of victimhood. Well, this is right up my alley. It almost feels like people don't leave space for there to be multiple victims at the same time. It's like people can't wrap their head around that. Like, everyone's so self-absorbed. Am I wrong?
No, you're right. You're right, for sure. I talk a little bit about this, about how our perceptions of victimhood and who's a perpetrator are like 100 to 0, right? And it's totally fair to think that your side, your preferred side, is maybe a little bit more the victim, right? So like, take immigration, right? If you're kind of pro-immigration, maybe you think the victim are families fleeing violence at the border. And if you're more anti-immigration, you think the victims are citizens harmed by, undocumented or illegal immigrants. And so, our moral judgments are tied to those perceptions. But in addition to like the fact that like, well, if I'm pro-immigration, I like only think of people who are fleeing violence at the border and not citizens who might get harmed. I think that there's like 0% victims, right, of American citizens. And those like 0 versus 100 perceptions make it really hard to have conversation. It's like black and white.
It's so black and white. And so much of it relates to your brilliant research, which I have really adopted and has really brought me a lot of clarity from my own book and my own work. So thank you. And your work specifically on moral typecasting is what I'm talking about. It's genius, Kurt. It really is genius. And I don't even know if you fully realize how relevant it is to the moment. When it's so I feel like we're living in the age of competitive victimhood.
Absolutely.
Is sort of the way I put it in my book. And I think moral typecasting perfectly explains it, because it's a very coveted spot to be if you're viewed as the victim.
Yeah.
It's a coveted special status where then you can do no wrong.
Right. And no one wants to be victimized.
Right. That's great.
In a competition, right? Yeah.
Great distinction. Yeah.
Right. So no one wants to like suffer. But if there's a conflict and one person is labeled the perpetrator and one person or side is the victim, everyone wants to be the victim instead of the perpetrator.
Who wants to be the perpetrator?
Yeah, right. No, right. Again, because we all think of ourselves as good people. No one's like, you know what? I'm the one who's like victimizing people here.
I remember, I'll never forget like O.J. Simpson on like in his second trial, and he was trying to defend himself. He's like, oh, everyone's against me, like it's funny to see like kind of people with a victim mindset.
Absolutely. I mean, everyone. I mean, even in make this point too, like who like typecasts themselves as a victim or a perpetrator. I mean, everyone typecasts themselves as a victim. And it's especially when people are about to blame you, right? Like, I feel like that's the crux of typecasting. Like when someone's trying to show you as a victim, when someone's trying to show that you're a perpetrator, like Harvey Weinstein, right? He comes into court like shuffling with a cane. He's like, oh, I'm like old and infirm. Like, no, you're a serial rapist, sir.
Yes.
And so we sometimes these disagreements are genuine and sometimes people are using them to shape our moral judgments in a kind of sneaky way. And so I think we need to maybe distinguish when people feel aggrieved versus people are like, I'm going to try to trick others with my victimhood. Yeah,
for sure. I mean, there's some really interesting research showing a correlation between virtuous victimhood signaling and the dark triad personality traits.
Oh, interesting.
And so there's definitely, a correlation there between those who at every turn they feel the need to signal that they're the virtuous victim. Yeah.
I mean, you're the expert on personality. I feel like we cite a little bit of stuff in one chapter on people who have like a victimhood mindset, and it's connected to things like narcissism, but also to bad attachment. That you use victimhood as a way to get attention and to feel like you might connect with others, but of course ultimately this backfires.
It does. I have a section in my book, Recognize Your Own Capacity to Be the Perpetrator. I just think that's huge.
Yeah.
And there's something in psychology. I promise I'll interview you. I don't mean to, but I'm excited. I'm trying to have a back and forth here. So there's this really interesting hypothesis called the Capone Hypothesis. That has come out, named after Al Scarface Capone. Despite many of his victims regarding him as, quote, pure evil, he views himself as follows, quote, I have spent the best years of my life giving people the lighter pleasures, helping them have a good time, and all I get is abuse, the existence of a hunted man.
Yeah, wow.
Psychologists have called that the Capone Hypothesis.
That's amazing. I mean, Harvey Weinstein as well has this quote about how he was the front runner of helping women in the movie business. He's like, I had women in my film before anyone, and no one talks about the good that I've done. And so just the fact that, someone who's done so much evil, maybe because they've done so much evil, right? They're compelled to see themselves as especially a victim to escape blame.
Yes. That's exactly right. So, okay, let's talk more about the excellent arguments in your book. It's interesting because you do make the case that we have a harm-based moral mind. Is that always the case? Are there instances of moral thinking that don't involve harm?
That's a great question, and it's something that the field has been debating for some time. My research, and it's controversial in the field, but a lot of my research suggests that it's always about perceptions of harm. And the fact that one side might not see the harms that you see really sets the stage for moral disagreement, right? Like we all agree that being against child abuse is about harm, but something like your stance on voter fraud, your stance on immigration or drugs, right? That one side's like, I'm trying to protect kids from harm, and you're just trying to let everyone use drugs, right? But both sides are legitimately grounding their moral judgments in harm, right? Like maybe someone uses marijuana to help with their glaucoma or their arthritis, right? So it's always about harm.
That's so like my gut tells me like, oh, there's got to be an example I can think of that dispels that, but I can't think. Oh, you're right. Like I'm trying, because I'm trying to be a good psychologist, right? I'm trying to be a good critical thinker, but you're right. I think of things like a lot of us feel like some things are immoral. I'm thinking like Jonathan Haidt's research. Like some of the examples he gives, like there isn't actually harm being done, but people still say it's immoral. But because you're right, it's because they perceive harm. So you're still right. But I was trying to think, do you know what I'm saying? I'm trying to think of examples he gives of just disgust response, which is not actually causing anyone harm in some of his classic vignettes. But your point is, well, the whole reason why they find it immoral is because they're perceiving harm.
Exactly. And harm is not like a binary, right? So you could see less harm in some of the examples he uses. And I guess to zoom out, right? So I'm one of John's biggest critics when it comes to his theory of like, there's morality beyond harm. And he's one of my biggest critics. And this is why I've had to be so careful and comprehensive with the studies that I run. And so what I do in my studies is I take the examples that he's come up with.
Okay.
That, if you're not a moral psychologist, they're pretty out there, right? Like consensual incest or having sex with the frozen chicken and then eating it, right? Like it's disgusting. People are like, well, maybe it's wrong, but but it doesn't seem harmful, but it does seem disgusting. But so we run careful studies where we, really look at people's intuitive reactions to these scenarios. And what we find is that people's moral judgments are driven by their intuitive, automatic, kind of like visceral feelings of harm. And it can't be just disgust, because there's so many disgusting things out there that are not seen as wrong. And so what distinguishes, like, if you're a parent, you get covered in poop when you change a diaper. Like, that's gross, but no one's like, you monster, And so what distinguishes the kind of immoral harm or immoral disgusting things from non-immoral disgusting things is like really the presence of harm.
According to you.
Yeah. I mean, you can even just think about it, right?
I'm trying.
Haidt has an example of like, rolling around in urine for performance art, or using some of these examples. Again, I didn't come up with them. Like letting a kitten rub itself on your genitals to be aroused. Like these seem so wrong, I think, because you're like, well, think of the harm to these like poor animals or to people, or and I think it was just disgusting. Like someone stepped on some gross poop. Well, then that's disgusting, but it's not immoral because it's not harmful.
Just talking about politics for a second, or I should say returning to politics, because it's just on everyone's mind right now. You made a really cool point. You said, but while someone on the left might emphasize the threats of growing inequality between rich and poor, systemic racism, and the destruction of the environment, someone on the right might emphasize the threats of banning firearms, restricting religious freedoms, and destroying sacred national symbols. Okay, so whenever I try to make such an argument to some of my extremely like left committed psychology colleagues, they go berserk and say, you can't both sidism this. The Republicans are the true evil. Now I get this all the time, like all the time. There are these, our field of psychology is full of like left committed biased psychologists. It's the truth. And so they get so mad when I say that, because I like to think like that. Like that sentence I just read of yours is how I like to think. I really like that kind of balance there. I want to understand what's in front of me and make some decisions based on what we currently have. And so I love that way of thinking, but do you understand that there are a lot of people who would really balk at that based on their own commitments and say, you can't both side this?
Yeah. I mean, I think folks on the, speaking of both sidism, right? Like folks on the left and the right think that any willingness to try to understand the other side is betrayal.
They do. You're right.
And so, but, as a social psychologist, I feel like we have to understand the minds of everyone. And that's including folks who might vote or think differently than us. But it doesn't mean their minds are different. And I think this is the big worry with some theories out there. That's like one side is, authentically moral and the other side is not. And there are theories out there that say like, well, it's really liberals or it's really conservatives who are the good people. But I think at the end of the day, we all have the same hardware. We all have the same desire to protect ourselves. And so you need to take those facts as a given when you look at the mind and try to figure out, well, what drives moral disagreement? And that sentence you read suggests that it's different concerns about protecting ourselves and different kind of basic assumptions about what causes harm.
Yes, and since we're having a conversation here, I think there's something else going on that I've noticed where I think that if transgressions are happening on your in-group, you're much more likely to just excuse it and to just overlook it if you're committed to that group than the other side is to let it go. And I saw this in the most recent Trump rally in Madison Square Garden. I wrote a tweet like I didn't feel like the tone was very humanistic and kind. There were a lot of things that I felt were objectively rude to the people of Puerto Rico, for instance. And to me, it boggles my mind that that's not just an objective truth, that's rude. So the way people responded were, "Oh, Scott, you're so caught up on the left that you don't understand that this stuff's subjective." And I guess I just don't get it. Like, if I say to you, "Fuck you, Kurt, I hope you die," how could someone say, "Oh, Scott, that's subjective. That's you're being biased because of your own lens"? So do you see my point? I don't understand why there aren't certain things that are so obviously rude to everyone that we can't at least all admit that that's rude. Yeah, I guess I don't get it. Can you explain this to me, Kurt? And do you share my confusion at all?
It's kind of funny, right? Because we were just talking about how these perceptions of harm vary from group to group, right? And I think that this is another example, right? Like this is an example that, on one side, you're like, look, this is so like calling what an island of garbage, that comedian said, right? That seems so obvious wrong and harmful to many people, right? To both of us, I think. But for folks on the other side, they're like, look, it's just a joke. And in fact, we're doing some research now about these perceptions of comedy, right? It seems to be like, hey, just lighten up. It's just a joke. It's just poking fun at our convictions. And so I think as many folks on the right as well argued, like Marco Rubio, right? He was like, that's not a very funny joke if you call it a joke at all. So I think there are folks on both sides who think that, but the whole point of our perceptions is that they do vary. They do vary. And so maybe some people would say, well, the real harm we should be considering is Harris's policies or, So
it all comes down to a hierarchy or ranking of perceived harms, not whether or not something in isolation is good or not. Because people, if they see a greater harm on the other side, then they'll be more likely to forgive the harm on their side.
Yeah, actually, yeah. So I appreciate you bringing that up because all these contentious moral issues are ultimately trade-offs, right? They're trade-offs about like when it comes to abortion, no one's like, I just want to hurt women. if you're on the right, you say, or you're, pro-life, you say, well, I really want to protect fetuses. And I just know that, I acknowledge that there might be some suffering caused. Likewise, pro-choice folks are like, well, I just want to protect women's reproductive rights. And I understand, right, that there might be some harm caused to fetuses. So I think these are trade-offs, but when you're in those positions, you only emphasize the kind of dominance of the harm you're concerned about.
I get it. That's really, really elucidating, Kurt. Thank you. I've got to ask at this point, why does harm drive our moral minds? Like, what about the course of human evolution made that be the case?
Yeah, great question. And I think ultimately it comes down to our nature, and that's a nature I think we've misunderstood for a long time. So if you think about, who we are deep down, who we evolved as, you look at museum dioramas, right? Let's say the Museum of Natural History, and there's like pictures of cave men and women with spears hunting mammoths. And I think that's mostly not true, not in the midst of evolution. So to hunt a mammoth or any big animal, right, you need stone-tipped spears, you need a lot of coordination. We didn't have stone-tipped spears for a long time. We just had sharpened sticks. And we were a lot smaller back in the day than we are now. So we were little, furry, ultimately terrified apes that spend most of our time hiding from predators and not hunting them. And I think if you look back in the record, you'll find that mostly we were prey. We were terrified. Our kids were picked off by eagles. We slept in the night and our children got eaten by cougars, right?
Yeah.
So our entire psychology is built around concern about getting harmed and protecting ourselves. And you can draw kind of almost a straight line from millions of years ago of being afraid to being afraid today, not of animal predators, but of moral predators.
Yeah, that's a great kind of tracing the evolution of this. So it is something really deeply ingrained in us. Earlier, I was trying to say, what is it? Is it a need? It's a module. It's like it's an evolutionary module in a way.
Yeah, I mean, that module is a powerful word, but I think I don't think you need to say it's like encapsulated in our mind as much as just like underlying a lot of things, right? Like just the history that's kind of like baked into all sorts of places in our brain.
Kurt, you're such a social psychologist.
I know.
Clearly, if evolutionary, you just made the argument. It's in our genes. That would be a logical outgrowth of the evolution that you just described.
Yeah, I agree that definitely it's in our genes. And then the question is like, where is it in our brain? I don't know.
Sure.
To me, it's a black box that just cools the blood. As far as I know.
I love it. I love this whole conversation. Oh boy. So, and then how does harm fuel morality? How does the process work? Can you guys go a little bit deeper into what you've observed?
You bet. So,
thanks.
I mean, as I mentioned, right, it's all about a matter of perception. And so maybe this is a little more kind of like in the science than is in the book, but we have a kind of template in our mind. So here's an example of a template. Let's say I say like, what's it like to go to a restaurant? And then your template is like, well, I sit down and someone comes and takes my order and then brings me food, right? Like, and if something was exactly, you sit down, you take your order, bring your food, you pay for it. You're like, well, that's a restaurant. And when it comes to morality, our template for something that's immoral, for something we should get outraged about, is harm, and in particular, victimization to someone vulnerable, right? So if you're like, look, this act victimizes someone vulnerable, like child abuse, you're like, that's obviously immoral. And then the more it kind of resembles that kind of thing, the more you think your mind kind of detects something in the world as immoral, right? And so if you're like, well, I kicked something out in the woods. I'm like, okay, well, I'm assuming it's a tree, so it's probably all right. And then you're like, well, it turned out to be a puppy. I'm like, oh, wow, now I know that's moral because there's like this vulnerable victimization. And so ultimately our mind is like a vulnerable victimization detector when it comes to morality. And the more there's that, the more our moral sense is triggered?
There's a lot there because it feels like there's a difference between the left and the right in their focus on, quote, vulnerable populations. But that's only at first blush. You're giving additional nuance here, suggesting that while that may be an explicit thing, with the left using that phrase, we care about vulnerable populations, the right caring more about other issues. In reality, it sounds like you're saying, like, even the right, a lot of it comes down to what they view as the vulnerable populations to protect. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, it's absolutely fair, but I think you do hit on a nuance that, well, I'll go through the data. So we asked, thousands of liberals and conservatives to tell us who they think is especially vulnerable to victimization, and by how much. And what we find is that conservatives, we're talking like committed conservatives, 7 out of 7 on a conservative scale. They think that all people are roundabout equally vulnerable to suffering. So whether you're white or black, right, whether you're an immigrant or a citizen, whether you're a Muslim or Christian, you're roughly the same. And this kind of like really mirrors ideas of like America as a collection of individuals and individual agency. And so they would still base, committed conservatives would still base their moral judgments on vulnerability, but they see everyone as kind of equally vulnerable, whether you're a CEO or, a worker in a company. You can still bleed if you're cut, right? You're still disappointed if your goals aren't met. On the other hand, committed liberals, like a 1 out of 7 on conservatism, they see really big differences in who's especially vulnerable to victimization. They see folks like Muslims, undocumented immigrants, right, maybe poor African Americans as exceptionally vulnerable to harm. And then folks that, belong to groups that are maybe, you could argue, are less marginalized, right, especially in progressive circles. Those
billionaires?
Yeah, billionaires, exactly. Cops, right? Progressives see those folks as basically almost impervious to harm. And so you've got this really powerful tension now between liberals who are like, look, there's 2 groups of people in the world, oppressors and the oppressed, the vulnerable and the invulnerable. And then conservatives who are like, look, everyone is basically equally vulnerable to suffering. And those are hugely different narratives, right? Like conservatives are like, well, it doesn't matter to what group you belong, you can still suffer. And liberals are like, well, it matters vastly what group you belong to, and that dictates whether you can suffer or not. And I think we could agree that folks on the far ends of the spectrum are not typical, right? That's the whole point. But it's interesting how they disagree. It's ultimately about vulnerability, but they see it really differently.
What do you think?
It's a good question.
What do you think the truth? What's the truth?
I mean, the truth is hard to ferret out because we see the world so imperfectly, and there's so much room for wiggle. But I think there's a grain of truth in both, not to, to kind of like see the humanity in both sides. But I think it is the case that there are systemic differences in vulnerability based on your group identity, right? It's just, and I think even conservatives, all but the kind of most extreme conservatives do believe this. So we do find differences, right? It is the case that if you grew up extremely poor, you are generally more vulnerable to being mistreated, right? Than someone who grows up rich. At the same time, I think we should also understand that, individuals have some agency and have some choice. And, and even if you are a richer person, you still suffer, if your child is injured, if your child is killed, right? That's still sad. And so it's a tension between kind of this idea of like a victim as an individual versus a victim of someone belonging to a group.
Oh, well, that you nailed it. You nailed it. That's it. Individualism versus, group-based harm. Wow. Yeah, that really helped me really see that within that framework. Thank you. Look, let's just spend the rest of the time talking about what we can do to bridge divides.
Yeah, it's tricky. It's hard. But
no, you've thought about it. Yeah.
I can tell you one thing that you shouldn't do that my research kind of reveals, kind of surprised us. So if you ask people, what's it going to take for you to respect someone on the other side? The majority of people, and we've done this, they tell you, just give me the facts, right? If I'm talking to someone on the other side, I want them to give me the facts. And then we can agree on what the truth is and then take it from there. And we say, great. Let's test a conversation now, and here are some facts. Well, it turns out people, they say, those aren't the real facts. Give me the real, those are fake facts, right? And so the problem with kind of political conversations now is we have such different facts that we can't find common ground when it comes to statistics or, data. Instead, what our data show is that the best way to bridge divides is through stories. Personal experiences where you talk about the harms you suffer, where you talk about the vulnerabilities that you fear might get exploited. And those are the ways to better bridge divides.
Do you see good examples of that happening anywhere?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, any kind of media source you look at, you'll find some differences. So in one study, we looked at YouTube videos about abortion, and we looked at the comments of those videos. And the comments of YouTube videos are not known to be especially supportive or kind. So it's kind of, a challenging way to test our hypothesis. And some videos are about people's abortion stories. This is my abortion, or this is my decision not to have an abortion. Or some of those videos are about statistics, right? Here are how many abortions happen in America today. Here's how easy or hard it is to have an abortion. And when we looked at those video comments, we found that the videos where people talked about their stories, the comments were much kinder and much not only more positive, but also like socially affiliative. These people wanted to be like, oh, I want to be your friend, basically. We find it in, shows on Fox News, on CNN. Hosts are more generous with their guests when they emphasize personal stories and facts. And then we find it in conversations too. And I think, listeners today will, you just try it at Thanksgiving or Christmas, whatever, any holidays where there's potential for division, and it works a lot better. And I'm happy to talk about more tips as well.
Oh, please.
So, one of the best tips I'll say is to, when you're having a conversation, try for understanding.
Yeah.
Not for winning. And this is why stories...
Where's the fun in that?
I know, right? Don't we all want to win? Isn't that why we're here on this earth?
So
just
boring.
To dominate the other side with facts, right? Like you look at social media, you're like, I just owned this person. And that's the video you want to click. I can't wait to see my side own the other side. But like, no one comes away from that, in the end, like happier. No one changes their mind based on fact. Like no one's like, oh, you know what? I believed this about abortion or immigration, but then this person gave me this statistic and like, boy, now I changed my, like never. That never happens, right? Instead, if you want to be like, oh, I had a good conversation and now I see the humanity in the other side a little more.
Yeah.
That comes from like, oh, they were trying to understand me and I was trying to understand them. And they were telling me about their personal experiences and I was trying to learn about, not win, learn about them, Yeah. I had this like Uber ride with a Christian nationalist some time ago. I'm like, yeah, look, I studied morality and politics, and folks are usually like, well, hold my beer, like here's my story.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you know many Christian nationalists. I don't. But there's potential for me to be like, well, I don't know about that idea. But at first I was like, well, tell me how you think about this idea, right? Tell me why. Tell me what the roots of your belief and like what stories about yourself led you to this belief. And that conversation went much better than it could have because he felt like I was trying to understand and not win. So it can work even in kind of extreme cases.
Yeah, people really just want to have their voices heard. They want to feel like they matter, and they want to feel like, they get it. They want to get it out. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I always find it interesting, like these examples of these like people who kind of infiltrate the Ku Klux Klan, kind of befriend them and then eventually change their minds. Like there are real good examples of that. But I think it takes a certain kind of person to do that. To put the outrage to the side is not easy when your own self is threatened.
Absolutely, right.
It's easier to just intellectually put the outrage to the side when it's not something self-relevant. But yeah.
Right. Again, like, if our minds are motivated by victimhood, as I know we both argue, right? Like if you're in a situation where you feel threatened, where you feel like someone's the clear perpetrator, and not only are they victimizing others, but also you, like in this case of Daryl Davis, the black man and blues musician who befriended hundreds of KKK members and got them to hang up their robes. Like, absolutely, that takes a special person who's willing to like you're going to sit down with someone who thinks that you're less than human. That takes a ton of fortitude and compassion and patience. And there are people out there who are willing to do it and bridge divides. I'm not saying people should have to do that, but it's good for humanity that there are people who are willing to do that.
But it's just interesting. Like, people are funny. Like, even with their beliefs, like they don't have those beliefs. They don't hold those beliefs all the time. And the humanity can crack through, I think, with anyone. Do you know what I'm saying?
Absolutely. Yeah, right. Like at the end of the day, we can interact as fellow and equal human beings.
So you say that facts don't bridge divides. Why is that? Why is science so under attack these days?
Yeah. I mean, I think there are lots of reasons why facts don't bridge divides today, right? We have different media environments on the left and the right, social media bubbles. But I think, if we go back to evolution, right, our genes and our brains, we've never really been well equipped to deal with statistics, to deal with, these kind of distributed facts that we're talking about today, right? If you're sitting around the campfire, it's night, you've got your family and friends around you, you're camping. The things you're going to talk about, the things that are going to resonate with other people are stories, right? Like, this thing happened. I heard this thing happened. There was a bear attack, whatever. You're not like 67% of people, right? Like that is not a good campfire story, because our minds had not evolved to process statistics. And so when you're in conversations, especially when you feel threatened, right, you're not going to really think about the truth of statistics. You're going to kind of anchor on to these stories, especially these stories of threat. And so this is why I think facts, aren't great. And when it comes to morality, facts just seem like not the right currency.
Irrelevant.
Yeah, exactly. They're not the right.
That's a shame. That's actually a shame, though, because like, wouldn't a logical, like Steven Pinker would be like, I want to know the probabilities and the exact evidence that this is causing harm before I make my conclusion. But you're saying most people don't think like Steven Pinker. You know what I'm saying? Steven Pinker would think like that. Come on.
I like your Pinker voice. It's very erudite.
Yeah.
Steve Pinker asked me a question actually when I was a second year grad student about. He gave a presentation about moral exemplars like Mother Teresa, and his question was basically like, I know you think that you have in your study that Mother Teresa is a hero, but like, wasn't she actually kind of cruel and callous to the people she took care of?
Yeah.
I still remember that, 20 years later.
That's funny. No, I mean, do you see what I'm saying? Wouldn't a really logical, rational mind want the facts?
Yes, I think that's true. And I think everyone wants facts when it's about like, what blender should I buy? Which model car should I buy? But when it comes to morality, we just think that those facts are not the right facts, right? That there must be facts out there that support my idea. So you still want facts, but you want the facts that support you, right? Like if I'm like, look, this many people suffer at the border, this many innocent immigrants like fleeing, I don't know, sectarian violence in Central America. And then you're like, if you're anti-immigration, you're like, well, sure. But when they come into the country, they cause crime and take jobs. And so the real facts we should be considering are
experiences.
US citizens, being killed. How many citizens or jobs are taken or being killed by, gangs of immigrants, right? So I think you're just like, look, that's not relevant. And I want to say facts do matter once you kind of establish these stories, right? But when you're so entrenched in your moral view, you only consider facts that are consistent with those beliefs.
Yeah, my mind just keeps thinking about they're eating our dogs. That's a story, not a fact.
Exactly, right. And so then you get into and this is maybe, too huge a question for any, one podcast of what does it mean to be true? Aren't facts collection of stories, and isn't a story a particular fact? And it gets kind of head spinny real fast, but I think we're just used to dealing with one person's experience. And this is why when people lie, that news anchor who lied about being in a helicopter crash.
Yeah.
I'm blanking on it. We're felt so betrayed because we're like, wait a second, you can't lie about stories because you know what happens to you, And,
I hear Steven Pinker's voice in my head. Do you know what he's saying? Do you know what he's saying in my head? He's saying, Kurt, datum is not data.
True. I feel like that's the first time I've heard the word datum in a long time. Very, very erudite again. But again, we're confronted with so many studies where we're like, well, those data aren't the right data. They weren't collected.
Okay, postmodernist.
It's true, right? But lived experiences, do matter. And even if you think about folks like Pinker, and even if you think about folks like Haidt, right, who often argue similar claims, right? Those folks will say, well, here's this experience I had on Twitter. Yeah. Here's this experience I had teaching in my classes.
That's true. So
even those folks will anchor on their own experience and then marshal facts that kind of support those feelings. So all of us, in a sense, are kind of powerless in the face of our own lived experience. Because we're human beings, and that's the lens we see the world through.
Yeah, good point. Why is hope and humility important for helping us bridge divides?
Well, at the end of the day, whether you live in a community or a city or a country, we might vote for different people or believe different things, but ultimately we need to come together to achieve greater things. We need to have conversations to figure out the right way forward. And those compromises and conversations require us to see each other as human and to work together. And I think that's why humility is necessary. And I think hope is warranted because at the end of the day, we talk about this, a little bit. I talk about this in the book. No one is out there trying to destroy the world. No one's a supervillain who just wants to burn it all down for the sake of it, right? We're all trying to just build something better ultimately. And I think recognizing that core human motivation, I think, can give us hope to have those conversations, to bridge those divides and to work together.
As my grandmother would say, from your mouth to God's ears. Kurt, I can't impress upon you enough how important I find your research and how it's influenced me in my own work. And I really, truly wish you all the best with your book tour. And thank you for chatting with me today.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me on.